So the next type of vulnerability that Drozer is really good at being able to detect are content provider-based vulnerabilities. Providers are essentially a way of being able to access data from an application from somewhere external to that application. So if like app number 1 wants to access data from app number 2, it will typically use a content provider to be able to access that data. Now, some content providers are hidden behind permissions. Some of them are not hidden behind permissions. If they're not hidden behind permissions, they're accessible from anywhere, which means that we could potentially do something with that to expose data. Now, with that in mind, we have to consider some of the information here regarding the content providers. In general, being able to query a content provider isn't necessarily an issue. However, if you're able to do SQL injection to a content provider, that can be a big issue. So we'll take a look at what that can typically look like inside of here. So if you want to expose content providers that exist on an application, we can do that through Drozer, and we can do that through the following commands here. So if I run scanner.provider.find URIs, then I go -a and I give it the name of the application. What this will do is it will expose to me all of the URIs that exist. The URIs are the content providers that we may be able to query. So you can see that there's 2 of them here that we're actually able to query. And I just sort of want to give you a bit of an idea about what this looks like from sort of like a typical legitimate perspective. So if I create a shell into my device here, I can do something like this. I could say content query. I think you do -URI, and then you put in like the URI that you want to query. And what happens is this will essentially run through a specific type of query, and you can typically provide them with some arguments. And those arguments can be interpreted and potentially exploited. So I think I might have to put 2 hyphens into it. Yeah, I have to put 2 hyphens into the URI. So there should be 2 hyphens here. So this is what the actual command would look like. So you see when I run this, it actually gives me data that's inside of the database. And what I can do with this is I can like provide a specific projection, right? A projection is the fields that I actually want to see. So for instance, if I want to see just the title, I could say projection title, which will show me just the title. So if you take a look at the actual code here, it can help you understand a little bit more. When we use the query portion, what it will do is it will utilize this query function inside of the provider, and all content providers are going to look very similar. So what you'll see here is that when it actually runs the query, it runs it through a query builder, and it provides it with a projection. Now, a query builder is generally relatively secure. However, projections have to be set in a very specific way. What we should be doing with a projection is telling the query builder what columns are actually valid to be able to be inputted. If we don't do this, then you can input theoretically anything into that projection, and it will actually get executed as SQL code. So to demonstrate this sort of idea, let me show you what this looks like from my ADB shell. So I have the projection for title. Instead, I could replace this with something different. I could do something like star from SQLite _ master. And then I can put like the comment to comment out the rest of it. What this does is, so when we do the projection, it injects the data between select and from. So what I'm doing is the select is already there. So then I just put star from SQLite master, and then I comment out the rest. So that just shortens the query to select everything from the master table. The master table holds all of the information about what exists inside of this database. So what you can see here is you can see all of the table information. This tells me that SQL injection is possible. So this allows me to be able to see that sort of information. Now, of course, we don't always want to be doing this manually because it takes a lot of time to test a lot of content providers. So luckily, Drozer actually has some built-in ability to be able to do that. So the way that you can test this is you can do something like this. You can say run scanner.providers. Or I think it's just .provider.injection, and then -a, and then we put in the name of the application again. And what this will do is it will attempt injections on each of the providers, and it will tell you if you can inject through the projection or if you can inject through the selection, which you can do in both of these cases. So when we talk about the selection is actually the where clause. So we can give it a where clause, we can give it a projection as well, and both of those seem to have injection enabled on them. So now, in general, once we have this information, we're able to run a query like I just did here to get all the information from SQL Master. And then utilizing that, we can get other pieces of information. If there's more data inside of this database that we shouldn't have access to, we'll be able to get to that utilizing this. So that's sort of the general idea and gist of what we're going to be doing with this. And just to show, like, you can get the same sort of information inside of Drozer, and you can get that through running scanner.provider.SQL tables. And what this will do is it will essentially just give you all of the tables that exist if a content provider is vulnerable. So as you can see, it tells me that these are the tables that are accessible through this injection, right? So when I'm doing this, like, for instance, if you want to see what an injection could look like, I could replace this with star from, like, for instance, Android metadata. And that could expose the metadata to us. I could do this from notes, which is the other table that exists. And that's the sort of stuff that we got from the content provider, so that's not overly interesting. But, I mean, you can get a lot of other things, such as, like, the SQLite version. I think you could do that just generally through something like this, for instance. And that would be a good example of the sort of things that you could do with this sort of vulnerability. So this gives you a good idea of how content providers can be exploited and how to find those vulnerabilities through Drozer.